Strategically going forward, he'll make a strategic purchases if he's got the right property. Existing stores,
We're looking for a new well, I mean, it's only in the right now. Identify some people
so he's going to saturate this area.
Somewhere where you say, where's the location now? In Savannah. Where else is
I used to do a lot of this in retail.
Yeah, right.
The three most important things in retail: engagement. Imagine what's the same in the restaurant. I mean, we used to know what your draw is, so you know where people come from, where they come from,
quite a bit.
5 mile radius.
Yeah, 5 miles.
5 mile radius, so that kind of gives you a circumference to work with. And a lot of demographic information about so I mean, it's a matter of figuring out, what sort of demographics you need to support one of your
This is why we're looking at
compared to, you also got to look at the other guys who are right, because some of this stuff is split up, down
maybe I'll give you a drug on that.
I haven't done that. So when I was done doing that, it was probably, I used to, let's see, it would have been 1985. I didn't go on, I was just going on real estate trips for those discount department stores. We got down to where we had a location. Right. And I'd go out there. I'll get kind of small bus. Spend time there. You got to look at it. At least when they brought it in, they worked. The Hills discount department stores, when I left, we had roughly about 100. Basically, and they were like hours, so I was
Oh, really?
back where I was just but I used to know all the guys. Run into him, trade association. Spent a lot of time with us. I could get him out of our company. They were very good on it. Tell them, guess what I can talk about.
Yeah.
I had a bunch of other the other part of the mice is they took the check from the advertising basically was
All right, everybody. Hello, everybody. I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. So if you want to grab a seat, if you want a seat. Good. Okay, thanks for coming. My name is Carl Stevens. I'm the Assistant General Manager for the Landings Association, and we have another good turnout here. I really appreciate you coming. This is the third in our initial series of budget workshops that we have. Did 2 in the fall, and of course tonight's focused on the reserve study that just got complete. We plan to do more of these as we go forward. This has been successful. Besides having a decent turnout in the room, we have, each time we do these, we have a few hundred people watch them. So we hope to keep growing that and sharing more of this, doing quarterly financial reports, other budget workshops as they're warranted, and really keep this dialogue going with the community. We don't have answers tonight. I know some people may be coming and saying, all right, the reserve study is complete. What does that mean for us as far as the assessment goes? We don't have those answers tonight. This is just the start of that process. So we're focused really on the reserve study and the implications for us. For the reserve study, why did we do a reserve study? We put it together to determine if our current capital reserves are at the appropriate funding level. What do other homeowners associations do that are like us? What's the best practices? We really wanted to compare to industry standards and understand that. We've been talking about our aging infrastructure. So we have the Landings is going to turn 50 in 2 years, and we have this aging infrastructure. And last year's a good example. We had about $300,000 of unplanned expenditures and 2 failing roads and some storm drains. So as we're seeing some acceleration with that, do we have the right funding level in there? So what we did was we put out a request for proposal to have a reserve specialist come out and conduct a reserve study. We use an industry called Community Associations Institute. What that does is that's what a lot of the homeowners associations belong to. They tell you best practices, here's what you need to be doing, and they provide a lot of resources for small, medium, and large communities such as ourselves. The board approved the study in September last year, and then the independent reserve specialist came out and did several on-site visits, photographs, documentations, and did some research to put his reserve study together. So we just got the draft reserve study report about 2 weeks ago. Our reserve subcommittee, which is members of our finance committee, have gotten together and looked at it and said, okay, explain this in more detail. Why is this your recommendation? What are industry best practices and the like? So then we could get a final product. We just got the final reserve report today. It's going to be posted online tomorrow. It is almost 600 pages long, but that's because every component that's $1,000 or more is listed in here. It provides descriptions of it, replacement times. There's about a 15-page executive summary that's listed in there that gets to the meat of the matter on it. So following the presentation, we're going to review the next steps. We'll say, hey, okay, now that we've gotten this information, what are we going to do with it? And what do we as a community need to talk about and review? So with this, what we wanted to do is have Charlie Shepard of Community Advisors go through the process he did to put the reserve study together, the methodology, give some generic examples at first of what goes into a reserve study and what do the different aspects of it mean. And then after that, look at more specific details related to the Landings Association and what his findings were from the reserve study. And then after that, we'll have a question and answer period. So you have a chance to either write down questions, you probably got a pen and paper when you came in, or just raise your hand at that point. But we do ask you to hold the questions till the end because there's a flow that we think will explain some of this stuff, and then we can always bring back up his presentation and look at specific slides if you want to look at some examples or some specifics as well. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Charlie.
Thanks. Good evening.
I lost my mouse. Hold on.
Thanks for coming. Good night. Can y'all hear me in the back? Too loud? Got a big mouth. You have a beautiful community. I see a lot of communities up and down the East Coast, and this is a special place.
We agree.
Yeah. Very nice.
And we want to keep it that way.
That's a good idea. We'll talk about that.
Maybe.
We will. I just couldn't see the mouse on my screen, and y'all weren't looking at what I was looking at.
Okay, since we're talking about the report, the very last section is some methodology and disclaimer stuff. The whole section before that is the backup of each component. You don't need to look at that unless you really can't sleep. All that feeds into the component inventory and the executive summary and all the funding plans. So stay up there, you'll understand it. Now, I'm going to walk through all that tonight. Ta-da! Okay, so Community Advisors is my company. I'm the analyst, I'm the owner, and I did your study. I did the inspection, and let's get started. There we go. Carl mentioned CAI. That's a trade group for associations around the country. They have 30,000 members. APRA is a bunch of reserve study folks like me. There's about 84 of us in the country. We get together once a year, talk about, how we operate, best practices, and things we all see. Give you a little background about me. Of course, I'm a reserve specialist and reserve PRA, reserve analyst. I've been in construction. It's actually longer than 30 years, but I had to cap it. I've done everything from property management to land development to leasing to the whole real estate world. So I've been in this environment quite a long time. I'm a licensed contractor and a home inspector in Florida. I used to be licensed in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee. I don't do that anymore. I'm concentrating on reserve studies. I've been on my board. I'm not doing that again, but I did for my neighborhood. I was the ARC chairman. I was on the board of the CAI chapter, and I'm a member of construction inspectors and the Association of Professional Reserve Analysts. I was actually on a CDD board. I don't know if you have CDDs up here, but that was a taxing district, so for a large community. Okay, so how many folks are familiar with this process? Okay. Well, a reserve study it's a process that evaluates your assets, projects when they're going to need to be replaced, what they cost, and develops a plan. It's pretty simple, the process. So you ask, why do we need to do it? Board members have a responsibility to maintain the value and manage the assets of the community, maintain the quality and the value of the community. The value of your house or your home or your condo is directly related to the common areas, the quality of everything that the association owns. And most important probably is prevent special assessments and deferred maintenance. You want to avoid those if you can. Okay, this is where it starts getting interesting. I do a lot of these presentations. I teach continuing ed classes for property managers, and the comments I get are, I won't be living here that long. Why should I reserve? Why should I contribute to reserves? Let the next guy figure it out. I hear that. We can just special assess when needed. Well, then you got to go collect the money. So that can be problematic. There's a better way to do it. Let's have a plan. We can identify what we didn't know, and then we can determine how much we need, and then how we're going to actually fund that. So he's got it figured out. Okay, these are very technical terms here. Okay, so this is what I see most people doing, and Dilbert over here, he says he has no idea. But Puta, MIG, and Willow, anybody know what those are? Yeah. Okay, Puta is they pull a number out of thin air. See that a lot. My guess is good. See that some. Willow I see all the time. Let's fund operating, whatever's left over we'll shove into reserves. Not such a good plan. None of those are good plans. So you do a reserve study and then you have a good idea what you need to do. Okay, this is your beautiful property, as you know. So I'm going to show you demonstrate the funding plans and the math and the process and everything about how I actually made this. That's me in my laboratory. Okay, so there's two parts to this process. One is the physical. I came out and looked at all your assets. I didn't look at every piece of pipe, but I look at, the streets and the playgrounds and the signage and the guardhouses and this place. I've been in this room a couple times, and all the marine components. I look at them, I measure them, count them, determine the quantity, their condition, how long I think they're going to last. And then I have an idea of their replacement cost. I'll tell you a little more about that in a minute. So what is included and why do I select those components? Well, there's some guidelines from CAI and APRA, national standards about what components are candidates for a reserve analysis. And that's a little flexible, and I'll actually refer to that in a minute. But it's a four-way test. Components maintained by the association, they should have a useful life of at least a year. Replacement cost above a determined dollar amount. In your case, it's $1,000. and they have to have a predictable life. Is that for me? Is that my phone?
Supposed to happen before 5.
Oh. So typically, we include street resurfacing, bridges, roofing, exterior windows and doors, fencing and gates, vehicles, equipment, mechanical equipment, the big stuff, you know, your big components. Are we including painting the little bathroom building at the playground? No, that's an operational expense. There's a lot of those that are captured by the operating budget. So there's one. That's one of your bridges. I walked across that dodging golf carts. Got some retention ponds. This is actually a pipe. That's what, with a bunch of roots growing through it. So it's one of your major expenditures I'm sure you have heard about. Some cart paths, your facilities, public works, buildings. Right here, there's the admin building. This is to show you that it actually came here. Your, some of your equipment, your fuel storage at your public works, all this stuff costs money. It costs money to replace it. The Marshview Tower, which is really pretty nice. Some of your heavy equipment, which is very expensive, as you know. Actually, right here, and one of the guardhouses. So you have a lot of marine assets as well. Boardwalks going through the marshes and across some of the ponds. And you have a concrete bridge. So I want to give you examples of some of the components that you own in case you didn't know, and there's a lot of other ones. But the question is, some components don't have a predictable useful life. But if you follow the CAI standards, you wouldn't include them. Well, they can be very expensive. So we apply an allowance to those. So like stormwater components, signage, landscaping, irrigation systems. I'm not talking about replacing a sprinkler head, but if you had to replace, 4 acres of landscaping or irrigation, that would be a major expense. So my methodology I use, I will include those and apply an allowance to them. So you may have seen this in other places. This would be an example of a component inventory. You'd have, and these are just numbers. These are not your numbers. You have more than $18,000 from the streets. But you have asphalt, roofs, painting, fencing. Totals $208,000. This would go right into my software. You'll see this in the reports in different format. Useful life, remaining useful life. That's how it gets generated. That's the key. This graph, which is in the report as well, indicates your distribution of your assets. The blue, your roads are big. It's 39% of, almost 40% of your asset value is in your roads, and so forth. So these are actually the categories that I use to break down what you have. This is actually in your report. This is your expenditure chart. So the red is your annual expenditures. As you can see, that goes up and down. The funding plan that I'm recommending is in the green. That's going to be your annual year-end balance. And the blue line, or purple, whatever you want to call that, I like this because it's not going up and down. It's a gradually sloping over a 30-year period line. That shows your contribution increase, like 1% a year. And feel free to ask questions about this when we get to the question and answer period. If I'm going too fast, if you want me to go faster, I can go faster. So where do I get my component replacement cost? Well, the main place I get is from everybody I work with, because everybody's doing something. They're replacing boardwalks, they're replacing streets, buildings, siding, roofing. I work all over the place. So I see a variety of different types of buildings and facilities, communities. So I see what they're paying, and I still have ties in the construction world. So I see what the local market's bearing. Historical costs from a client, which in this case is very good. Your community's been around a while. You've had several cycles of some replacements. So what I did is I looked at those replacement costs and had conversations with staff and questioned some of them. And we talked about, does that make sense? So I looked at all these costs. I just didn't take the camp spreadsheet and plop it in. That would have really been easy. I didn't do that. I looked at every one of the components and the costs and said, let's change this or these work. And I didn't in your case, but there are publications that are available if you can't find a component. But everything that you have here is pretty standard. Much the same with the useful life projections. I see how long things are lasting with everybody else, including my community. You've got historic replacement cycles in your records, which I questioned and reviewed. Industry standards, how long should things actually last? And then my experience in the construction world. I've built or repaired just about everything you have out here. So I know how it was put in and how it's repaired and replaced. Okay, so I take all that information, then I give it to my analyst here, and I put it into the software. So I review the financial information that you're currently using, your balance of your reserves, your contributions, your funding projections that you're using now or you're thinking about using, and replacement costs and your budget and balance sheet, all those things. And then I have several financial models in my software that I test and see what's a good funding plan for you. I use Reserve Analyst. It's only good for doing reserve analysis. And then I develop a custom funding plan, which you'll see very shortly. Okay, well, you have to have a goal if you want to get somewhere. It's just like the same in reserve strategy. Some people, and I have had a couple of clients that said, we want our reserves to be at or near zero. In other words, we don't want to have any. It was a large community. They just special assessed. Well, that can get old real quick. But that was their decision. Could be 100% funded. That's great. Not very many people do that. It's just a lot of money tied up. Some states have statutory funding requirements. And then what I like to use is a cash flow funding model, which is called threshold funding. And it keeps your ending balance above a specific percentage funded or dollar amount. That's how I got that slowly rising curve in that chart. Is this making sense? Okay. It's really quiet.
You're good.
Okay, so all that rolls into your funding plan. And I have a couple of methods to do that. And there's some confusion about cash flow funding and component funding. If you've been around the reserve study or HOA world, component funding, a lot of people call it straight line. Accountants call it straight line. It doesn't have interest or inflation in it, so it's good for about that long, a year or less. Cash flow is more like your checkbook. Check goes in, checks go out. As long as you keep it above a certain level, you're happy. So component funding is the most conservative method. That is a full funding. There's no, we're partially funding a fully funded method. You can't do that. It's just 100%, and the funds are dedicated to that particular component. So if you were a board and you were using straight line funding, you really wouldn't use the roofing money to fix the roads. And I haven't checked your documents, but it might take a vote to do that. With cash flow funding, you have a bucket of money. So yours is a lot bigger than that. It's more flexible, and you take advantage of a threshold funding method. So what is fully funding? very confusing to a lot of people. This is the formula. Fully funded balance, which is how much do we need to have in the account for each component. And I'll have an example of that. Equals the effective age divided by the useful life of the component times the current replacement cost. Now, the effective age is not the age of the component. Yeah, confused? All right, watch this. Okay, you've seen this. Now I have this other thing over here. $208,000. We're going to talk about that roof right there. You saw this a minute earlier. Now it's in red. You got a $120,000 roof. Its useful life by warranty is 20 years. I said it's going to last 5 years. Okay, so there's your roof. It's a flat roof for your purposes. Cost 120 grand, 10 years. It was installed 10 years ago. It's got a remaining useful life of 5 years, not 10 years, because it's aged, it wasn't maintained. So you got to replace it sooner. So you should have $90,000 in that particular bucket for that roof. So now I've added a couple more columns over here. There's that 90,000 that you have in the fund. So it costs 120,000. That means there's 30,000 left to fund. You have 5 years to fund it, $6,000 a year. Are you fully funded? Yeah. You don't need 100% of the money today. You need it tomorrow. So a lot of people think, holy smoke, we need $208,000. I said, yeah, you do, but not today. You need it over the period of the study. It's like, if you're halfway through the useful life of a component, you should have half the money. Okay, cash flow funding uses that same formula, that same methodology, but we're not funding 100%. So you are not a fully funded funding plan. I'm going to show you how that works for you. So the question is, do we have enough money? Are our balances above the threshold we feel comfortable with? Are we comfortable with that risk? Because this is all about risk here. It's about the risk to our value, the risk to our community, the risk to our, we're going to get a special assessment. We want to mitigate that, or the board needs to understand that and plan for that risk. Okay, well, Jackie didn't understand this either. Percent funded is another very confusing element of the reserve study. It's a measure of funding level for a year. So I refer back to the CAI standards. They established some National Reserve Study standards many years ago that said if you're 0 to 30% or around 30%, that's pretty poor funding. 30 to 70 is adequate, and 70 to 100 is well funded. And you'll see that in the report. I'll show you on the screen here in just a second. So my favorite slide. It's all about risk. Now you as a community and your management understand what they didn't know. And whether you're 0 or 100% or you want to be in the mid-range and be adequately funded, that's a risk question. All right, now we're going to get, that's funny, isn't it? Come on. I dug around for that for a long time. I'm going to get into the specifics. Here's how yours works. So here's what we have. This is your community right here. These are real numbers. Your current replacement cost is $47,885,232. Your projected beginning balance is $7,213,000 roughly for 2021. We didn't do it for this year because you've already done this year's budget and you're moving through this year. So we're starting your funding plan in January 1, 2021. Interest rate is 1.75. That's over the term, the 30-year term of the study. You're getting less than that now. You're going to get more. I had to use a number. That seems like a relatively good number. And you're going to update this study as needed, so or on a regular basis, rather. And so we'll change that in the inflation rate to take advantage of current market conditions. And to begin the study, you're 30% fully funded. You're good today. Inflation rate, came from one of the biggest national home builders, because I do some work for them. I said, what do you guys use for inflation? They said 2.5. Okay, that sounds about right. Okay, so let me go back. I know you folks are saying, we've got a lot more than $47 million. It's more like 85 million. Well, it was. What I use is 47,885,232. The difference is how we allocated the money and the components that are included, and changed to some of the replacement cost. So let me explain that. Before, you had a stormwater pipe of almost $40 million, all being replaced in 55 years from whenever. And it didn't have any kind of predictability about it at all. So it's not really a predictable event, but it's a big number. So, we could either take 40 million and divide it by 100 years, which is probably an outside number. Or we could say, what I like to do is say, okay, what are you using every year for stormwater maintenance? What have you been using over a period of time? Let's plop that number in and see how it runs. Next year we'll adjust it, next year we'll adjust it. Because there's no reason to carry $40 million worth of replacement cost. It's going to jack up your contributions, and it's not a real number. So what we did, and this came from staff, 275 is a good number. So we're going to use that for about 5 years, 6 years, and we're going to drop that down to 250 for the next 22 years or whatever it is. And that's the end of the study. Period of study is 30 years. That would be for whatever needs to be done. We're not replacing all this pipe, nor would I have any idea when you would do that. But you're going to replace things as they break. You're not going to say, hey, let's have a new pipe. It's like as much fun as buying water heaters. You're not going to do that. Okay, here is your current funding projection. These are real numbers. Current cost, your contribution for 2021 is mapped out to be $2,139,280. You're going to get some interest on that. Your expenditures are $2.6 million. Your projected ending reserve is $6.851 million. You're 28% fully funded. So in a year, you're dropping 2%. Every year thereafter, you drop because the current plan is contributing less and less each year to reserves. You are not able to fund 2026 expenditures. You're out of money. 2025 is not very pretty either. You're going to end up with less than $1 million. So this doesn't work. And for the graphologist here, or the chartologist, this is what it looks like. You're okay? The first part of this plan, these are your expenditures in the green. And you see in short order, you're dropping down and you're in the red. This is something you do not want to do. That's got deferred maintenance and special assessment written all over it. Okay, so for comparison, I went to the other extreme. This is a fully funded plan. As you can see, you're at or about 100%. I can't get it exactly. It changes every year. But to be fully funded for year one, you'd need to put in $16 million. I don't think you want to do that. And another $3.2 million to fund that year. So year one, you're looking at putting in $19 million to say you're fully funded. I don't think you want to do that. But you know what that is. Oh, you do?
I'm sorry, house is up for sale.
It's not that bad.
I'm kidding.
Don't be depressed. The good stuff's coming. Okay, so this is what your fully funded plan would look like. This is a component fully funded plan with interest and inflation. You can see there's that large contribution that drops down to regular, gradually increasing contributions. But look how much money is sitting there. All that green is cash. That's your cash. And those are your expenditures in the blue. Those little cylinders. All this is in the report. Okay, this is what I'm recommending. This is something in the middle. Same replacement cost, contribution 2.830193. So $2,830,000 for 2021. Little interest, well, actually a lot of interest. Your expenditures are covered. You end up with $7,554,149 at the end of the year. You're 31% fully funded. I set the funding, me and Jackie Chan set the funding parameters in the software to be 30 to 70%. And so there's an algorithm that pings these numbers back and forth to generate this. But I don't want them to go up and down. So I want them to start at a certain level and then have a slow curve over time. So that's more than you're paying, but per home, it's probably, or per unit, something to consider as a doable thing. Here's that threshold funding plan. There's that sloping curve. It's a straight line. I don't know why they call it a curve. I guess I should have taken a trigonometry again, but that curve right there, that line is your contribution, and it slowly rises over time. Those are your balances that you're going to have at the end of the year. A bit less than the fully funded plan, but adequate funding. This meets the standards that CAI has set of at least 30% funding. Okay, so I thought it would be good to compare the three funding plans. You've got your projection that you're thinking about doing, fully funded, and the recommended plan that I have here. And you can see the green is a component. That's the fully funding. You got this gigantic contribution, and then it drops down. The current funding projection is the red, and it's pretty flat, or negative, really, over time, probably. Actually, the contribution stays the same. So that doesn't increase. The threshold funding plan assessment, or the contribution to reserves, and the plan that I'm recommending just about follows a fully funded plan. So without putting in that gigantic $16 million contribution, we're keeping up with the contributions that you would need for a fully funded plan. But you got to monitor this. I know this is a lot. So here's a pretty slide. This is the ending balance. This really shows you what happens to our cash. How much cash do we have at the end of the year? The red, you know what that means. That's what your current projection is. Component is a whole bunch of money sitting there. Right smack in the middle is the threshold plan that I'm recommending. So, you know, you're right in the middle of having cash tied up, and that should be adequate. There's some publications you can look at. CAI has this book. That's like $15 or something. It's pretty good. I've got a copy if you want to look at it. Best practices, CAI website, caionline.org. It's got all kinds of stuff. It's free. You can download it. This is one of them. This is pretty good. And that's it. That's a lot.
So before we get to, thank you, Charlie. Before we get to questions, we'll just get switched back over to hit a couple of slides about what the next steps are, and hopefully this will do what we wanted to do quicker this time. Thank you, Kristen, for working on it. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So what are the next steps? I mentioned that the Reserve Subcommittee, which is part of the Finance Committee, got the draft report a couple of weeks ago. So the Reserve Subcommittee hasn't even seen this final report. The Finance Committee has not seen the final report. The board saw a draft but has not seen the final report. So we have a lot of digging into this to do because, as I mentioned, we just got the final version of it today. So at that time, we need to analyze the impact on the current reserve funding projections. And we have a board policy for reserves. And what that policy says is we're not going to go below $5 million and $7 million is the target. Well, this recommendation would be for a higher amount than that. So, we have to take a look at that. We want to have some more community conversations. We've been very happy with these budget workshops. We want to have more budget workshops, focus groups, drop-ins, and talk about the different reserve levels and potential assessment amounts and what that means to you and to the community. And really, this is a two-way conversation because committees, board, staff, we have to digest these recommendations, and so does the community, because this is something different than what we've been doing. And so we really are going to have to get that feedback so that we can then understand what's the appropriate timing and an amount for an assessment vote. I mentioned at the beginning that we don't have the details on how this would impact that, because we have to have the community conversations and ongoing and see what's important to the community. How much risk do you want to have, as Charlie was talking about earlier. So we still have a lot of work to do, and definitely want to make sure everybody is staying engaged in the process. So what we want to do now is open it up to questions. I know we may or may not have had any on Facebook. I know we had at least one written one that I'll start us off with. Present reserve assessment enough to provide financing. I'm interpreting this to mean is the current amount going to reserves not adequate going forward? It's not. We knew that before. As you look in your budget book, we have a 1-year budget but a 6-year financial plan. And if we stay with a flat assessment, it gets to one of those acronyms you had earlier, what's left over after operations, things like that. So in one of our budget workshops, our first one, in fact, we talked about the changes that we made to the operations based on having a flat assessment over the last couple of years. And again, we've tried to cut service levels that aren't that noticeable. And then saying any excess funding is going to reserves, even to the point that for our operating fund, we need to have at least 2 months operating expenses in there, and that's industry standard. And in the past, if we got a little bit higher than that, that was okay. But now we're managing down to that minimum, which is about $1.5 million. So we're saying, we've cut service levels, we're bringing down the operating fund balance and putting it into reserves. But even with that, if we don't get some level of assessment increase at some point, then we're going into the red and not able to afford this stuff. So hopefully that was addressing that question. And then I'll open it up to who has questions, either written or verbal, or I don't know if we have any more written ones. For either for me or Charlie. Charlie, why don't you come on up here with me in case we have some technical ones?
Carl,
Yes.
Can I just ask you to clarify, and Charlie went through it, and to clarify for folks where it talks about what our current funding strategy or plan is?
Projections, right. So, yeah, so it says this, our current funding projections. Our current funding projections, again, this is assuming that we're providing the same reduced service levels in our operating fund that we had talked about a couple of months ago, or maybe it was in October. And then, again, any excess is going to reserve. So you see by nature that's going down, because operating costs it's going up slowly, but as it's going up, if assessment amount stays at $1,850, then the ability to put more money into reserves is not there, because you have to fund the service levels. Yes?
So how much was transferred to reserves in 2019?
In 2019, I want to say it was about $1 million.
$972,000.
Nice. Yeah, we got two. Nice. $972,000. So that came about because we had, again, we're drawing down to our minimum amount of the $1.5 million, but also we did better than budget in some areas, whether it was staffing expenses. Marina's dues came in a lot stronger than budgeted, and for revenues, and some of our expenses were down. So it is traditional that we will transfer money from operating to reserves, and especially with our intent to manage to the minimum of the operating level, that provided us a bigger opportunity in 2019. Yes.
Oh, can we go back to a slide?
Yes. Can you, Kristen, can you?
Slides from the end.
Yeah, give us just a second to get that
Sure.
switched back over.
Sure.
And I'll give you that because I think that's going to be specific to you.
Sounds like it. I think it was the recommended funding level.
Okay.
It shows what the forecast is and what you proposed to, how you propose to fund it as being a medium between fully funded and not.
Oh, you mean the chart?
Yes. Well, it was a yeah. It wasn't a
It's your
chart.
recommended funding chart,
Right.
Charlie.
The purple on it is 3 layers.
The threshold funding?
I don't know how to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's near the end.
Oh,
It's, yeah, you
It
still,
was quite near, right near the end, it was about 3 from the back. Yeah, there, yeah.
well,
Okay.
that was the.
That was the one in the red, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Is that the purple?
that's the full one.
That's full funding.
Next
Right,
one,
the next one.
there you go.
Now, what I see from that, right, is that the projected ending reserves are going to go from 7 million, which is in the savings account, right? Is that right, Carl? We have at the moment 7,554 in the savings account.
So the question is the money in a savings account? It is not in a savings account. We have a blend between certificates of deposit
Okay.
and
but
money
it's
market
cash.
funds.
It's cash.
It's cash.
It's
available
cash, but it's
cash.
earning a better rate than a checking
It's available
account. So,
cash.
right.
So, a few years from now, let's project 5 years ahead, it's gonna be 11 million and it's gonna be going up all this way. Why do we have to have such a large balance in cash? This is, I mean, at present rate, I reckon that's close to about 1 year subscription for everybody, right? The 7 million is about 1 year? Am I right?
I'm not understanding the question.
Well, you've got 7 million in cash lying in your bank accounts, right? In the association bank accounts. Yes?
Yes.
Right.
Well, for the reserves.
Yes.
Yeah, but it's in your bank account, it's cash.
It's liquid.
It's
liquid
liquid.
cash.
Right. It's,
Right. It's approximately 1 year subscription.
I don't know what that means.
Well, I mean,
It's really 3.
My fees, I pay about, what, 1850 a year.
Not all of that goes to reserves.
But to get 7 million, I'm saying every person is paying 1850, about.
But a lot of that goes to operations.
It's a simple question.
Okay, I'm
There's
sorry.
a bank account, you've got a bank account with 7 million in it. That's been contributed by people like me.
Yes.
Association, we've all contributed to that, right? And so,
Yeah.
1 year of my subscription is going into the association's bank account.
Yes,
And-
like
right?
everybody else.
I
Yes.
mean, that's got to be a fact, isn't it?
So
Yeah,
what's your-
part goes
So-
to operating, part goes to reserves, but yes.
So my point is this, right? Sure, we need to provide for annual expenditures which are obviously lumpy because of the very nature of the beast, right? But why do we have to have such a large balance of cash?
Okay, I'll answer that for you.
Right.
This is your baseline,
Yeah.
okay? So if you never called me again, you'd be putting that much money in. You're probably not going to do that. But to get out to these future expenditures and have a relative percent funding that is industry standards, that would be the balance. This is going to be updated every year or 2 or 3, and then that adjusted. And then you may decide that you want a lower floor or baseline than what's provided in the threshold funding.
What would be the problem if you said, right, we will fund it so that the projected ending reserve is as close to zero as possible?
What would happen there?
Yeah, what
You would
happen?
you would fund the expenditures for that year,
Right?
which you're doing,
Which
but,
would be lumpy. I
but-
accept that.
but you don't.
So-
You're not funding the future reserves.
No. What
You've got some
you
large-
probably need. This is my position, right? You because it's lumpy, right? Annual contributions. Sometimes it's 3 million. Sometimes it's not that different from what I see from this. The annual contribution is not that different each year. So it's not as if there's a cataclysmic event that says we've got 5 million this year that all of a sudden we're being. It's not a rainy day scenario.
Well, how you actually operate this is a community decision.
Right.
I'm illustrating where you're heading with the current plan, what a full funding plan is, and what is an industry standard plan. Now, do I want you to have $18 million in the bank? Well, in 25 years, maybe that makes sense because there's inflation on your replacement cost is going up. So this moves over time, and it'll be a board and a community decision to decide whether they want to have a lower ending balance.
It just seems
This was
incredible
an
to me.
illustration.
I have to
So if
say,
you look at year one-
it sounds incredible to me that you're advocating that this association should have $17 million sitting in a savings account. I don't get
If you follow this plan, that's where you will be in the future.
Yeah.
But
well,
year
that's
one,
why I say, that's why I'm asking.
Year-
Why do we have to follow
So
that
let me jump in here, and I think Charlie said it right. That's a community decision. We're not trying to decide that tonight. We're presenting what. Hold on one second. We're presenting what was the recommendation. Now this goes between 30 and 50, and never goes below 30. And certainly the board and community could say, well, let's target it towards 30. I know you'd rather target it towards 0, but that's part of what we want to do. We want to talk to the community.
Fine.
Where's the level of risk that
That's
you want,
fine,
and what do you want to do?
Because I really am against. Well, I think I've made my position
Right,
obvious.
yes.
I think it's rather it should be my bank account
Right.
rather than the association's
Sure.
bank account.
Sure.
Right? And of course, I don't want to be for us to go bankrupt. Not by any means. We've got to provide for the future. We've got to provide for wasting assets. There's no quarrel with that. My quarrel is the extent of the funding that is ever increasing. And I'm not going with your inflation argument either, because inflation is at an all-time low. Interest rates are at an all-time low. It doesn't make sense to me. It's as simple as that.
Okay. Appreciate your feedback, definitely. Who has the next question? Yes.
Yeah. You've done a good job in getting us a good return on the reserves that are there, so my hat's off. What sort of assurances do we have where all of a sudden you've got 7 million, 5 million, you've got $100 sitting in this reserve fund, that you don't decide to take that and decide, hold it, it's party time. Let's have a little party with this money. Are these funds locked up?
They are. Once they're in the reserves, they can't be used for operation. So yes, and you know they're
Is that
restricted.
in the bylaws, and I mean, or is this just a shake hand understanding?
No, it's not a shaken understanding. That's just how the tax treatments and the industry practices on it. You can't move from reserves to operating. So the other thing on it is I heard the term rainy day fund. It's not. These are all scheduled items for repairs and replacement. So we're not trying to put something in there we don't need, but what we're seeing based on this recommendation is the level that's in there might not be sustainable.
Okay, and Charlie, I've got a question for you. You know, all of us that live here, maybe we're a little egotistical. We think we're unique. What other like properties have you found that compares to the landings? I
Well-
mean, you're going out, you're comparing this to so-and-so, they spend such and such, you should be spending this. What else compares to the landings that you've worked with?
well, very few communities have
Thank you.
this many roads, this, 2 marinas, but they have similar components. So the funding level is not compared to what they're doing, it's compared to what you have. I was referring to the useful life of the components and the replacement cost. I wasn't referring to how much you should put in. Right. So, that's a decision that y'all need to make. So if you want, going back to you, if you baseline fund, you put in X number of dollars and you spend all that, you have no wiggle room. If something happens, everybody gets a bill. So you need a little wiggle room in here. I'm not suggesting it's going to be 18 million. This is a projection. This will be updated. This is a good start and a baseline for us. But you need to update it regularly.
Right. We had one here first, and then we'll come over. Yes.
You mentioned before that the reserve funds are invested in money market funds and certificates of deposit,
Mhm.
which sounds pretty conservative. Is there an investment policy that governs how they're invested?
Yes, there is, and in fact, it had an extensive update and rewrite last year, and we have an investment subcommittee off of the finance committee, and they meet at least quarterly to look at the different investment opportunities and options.
So if they decided that since the S&P was up 30% last year, that would be a good idea?
No,
for next
that
year?
is unfortunately no. But in any homeowners association, your very first thing is to protect the principal. Then you're looking for liquidity, then you're looking for yields in that order. So you've got to stay conservative because, yeah, you'd like the upside, but you can't have the downside when it's everybody else's money. Yes?
At one point, I thought I heard you say 1% increase per year would adequately fund our reserve. Is that
Yes.
a 1% increase per
Yep.
year on our assessment?
Yes, ma'am. Well, on this plan.
So the reserve, the annual contribution you see in 2021, 2.8 million, that's more than the contribution that we're doing this year. So it says if we got up to that level, then a 1% increase in the reserve contribution each year would fund this plan that you're looking at right here.
And just the reserve, because we got our assessment notice today.
Right.
It was broken down into the reserve and.
Oh, good timing.
Good time. No wonder you're here.
So that
I just got
1%
mine.
would only apply to that small part that goes into the reserve, not into the operating budget.
Right, that's correct. That's correct. So if you looked at that, if we got to the right, if we followed this recommendation, which we just now have, if we got to the level on your assessment bill that says this much is going into reserves, then it would be a small amount going up each year, again, following this plan.
So there would be a 1% increase on reserve and then another increase on the operational.
I can't speculate on what that looks like at this point because we'd have to sit down and look at our different numbers and some different options. Before I come back to you, I wanted to see, I thought I might have seen another hand. No. Yes, here you go. Back to you.
Okay, just so I understand it, what you're proposing here would be a 1% on the portion that is the reserves. If the reserves right now are 20% of our assessment, you're saying just increase that 1% to cover this?
No, because
That's what I'm.
right, because the annual contribution to reserves right now in 2020 is, I want to say, about 2.2 million. So it's about 2.2 million. So you're seeing a jump up in the amount that's there. What that's saying is, if you got up to that level of the total contribution to reserves, going forward, that amount only needs to go up 1%. We're not to that level as it is in 2020. We're decently below that.
What is the level?
About 2.2 million? Somewhere around there. Yes.
Just a clarification, when Charlie says if we run short, everybody gets a bill, that's a definition of special assessment? And that means
That'd be it.
requires a community vote?
Yeah.
So you run the risk of not repairing the road or whatever because we can't pay for it.
Right, and you know, Charlie didn't get into all of our funding mechanism. He just looks at what needs to go in there in his estimation. But yes, to that point, to have a special assessment, it cannot be used for operating. It can be used for reserves, and it's just like any other assessment vote that we have to have a 60% quorum of all owners, and of those voting, 2/3 have to approve it. So that's what's required. Thank you, Blake. Yes.
Carl, great report. Question, when is the board going to be bringing forward the next assessment for a vote?
That is still to be determined, and as I mentioned earlier in here, we think needs to be more community discussion and conversation on what the community will support. So at this point, it's looking to be a little bit later in the year. At first, we had thought this spring, but based on getting this report back and this recommendation back, we need to take a step back and take a look at that and really, again, as I say, engage the community and see where the support is for
So
something.
best guess when we see it?
I don't have that answer yet. We just don't have the timing yet figured out.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
Come on, another question. Two suggestions.
Sure.
There's not only one alternative to an assessment. The other alternative is borrowing. It's very easy right now to borrow money, and I don't see any reason why, if we really did have a major catastrophe, we couldn't borrow the money. That's one suggestion. The second suggestion is, why limit this to a capital reserve? Why do we not have a reserve that could be used? For example, the thing that hit us that we wish we had a rainy day for, literally, was the hurricane. But we couldn't use the reserves because it wasn't capital. So as a result of that, there was an assessment made to cover the cost of the hurricane. If this wasn't a reserve just for capital, it could be used for things like hurricanes.
Thank you. Yes, that's something that we've talked about, having a separate fund for something like that. The reason we haven't proceeded at this point is you still have to get that cash somehow. And so are people more willing to set aside money now for a rainy day fund that may or may not happen, or for something like the hurricane, a special assessment? So I don't dismiss that out of hand. That has been discussed, and we would continue to discuss
I'm not
things like
suggesting
that.
a separate reserve. I'm suggesting a reserve, call it a
Right.
general reserve,
Right.
if you like, not just capital reserve. A reserve for a rainy day, if you like.
Well, this reserve fund is restricted for capital repairs and replacements, so it would have to be a separate fund. But again, that's something that we can continue to discuss, definitely. Yes?
So, relatively new to the neighborhood, how is the delineation done between all this stuff that is in this report and say things like the clubhouses, the golf courses, all those?
Those are totally good question. People get confused about that all the time. The Lanings Club is totally separate from the Lanings Association, so they have their own. We call ours the Capital Asset Management Plan. They call theirs the FLUP, Facilities Land Use Plan. I guess it's FLUP. That's what it stands for. So they do their own. They do their. I think I have that right. So they do their own planning just like we do. Yeah, FLUP. Right. Yep. So, but it's two totally separate entities.
And I mean, what about any overlap? Say, for instance, how do you determine whether sidewalks and other stuff like that is a golf course related?
That is a perfect question. I'm going to turn that over to our Public Works Director, Sean Burgess. That's why it's a perfect question.
We do have multiple assets. When Brandiger was the developer and he went in and started separating out assets, 3 major assets that are divided, and we're still trying to work through with the club and the association as far as ownership and use are lagoons, storm drain system, and cart paths. So far we have an agreement with our cart path usage and who's responsible. Secondly, we have a draft document that hasn't been agreed upon by both entities yet for lagoons, and we do have an operational expense that the club pays into for all of our lagoon maintenance. So we have one entity, the association, that's managing all of the stormwater. And then we're still working on the storm drains. Biggest challenge with that is, with the storm drains, is looking at property ownership and how they are going across the systems. A lot of the early development, a lot of the main trunks of the storm drain system go through club property, and everything feeds in from associations. So we're still trying to work out what really the total cost would be for each entity with those. So those are the 3 major ones that are hitting between the 2 entities.
Okay, and are there any sort of like, how do we protect that, say the club were to go belly up at some point, and then, you know, the rest of the community is really nice, but nobody wants to move into the community because the club is. So what's the binding thing? You know, you're talking about all this arbitration that's going on to determine who does what. I mean, how do we determine that it's going to stay hand in hand for the future?
Well, I wouldn't use the word arbitration because that would seem to be going against each other. We have a great working relationship with the Lanings Club at the Lanings Company. I think everybody realizes that this community can only be as successful as the Lanings Club is. About 2/3 of residents belong to the club. It's a big driver for bringing people here. So it's in all of our interests to do it. Part of our strategic plan talks about working closely with the club and the Lanings Company. So that's why between a staff, really good working relationship, and also committees and boards, we do work across the organization. So yes, I totally agree. That's the most important thing that drives the community success. Yes. That's the next question. Yes?
I have a question about, could you go back a couple of charts to the baseline that created all the vetting?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
The baseline that created all the reading.
That one.
The chart that fed into that.
The chart, the slide right before that.
The data.
There you go.
I thought I understood you to say that the board had a policy of a projected ending reserves never going below 5 million.
We have these, yeah, the question is what the policy going below 5 million? Yes, go ahead.
So my question is, this shows projected ending reserves going red, you know, from 20, 25, or 26 down. Why would that show a policy is, the reserve never looked at.
Because we are assuming no assessment increase in these projections. This is not what our plan is. This is not what we want to happen. This says if assessment remains at $1,850 each year and we continue our reduced service levels, we're going to run out of money in reserves. Then we'll run out of money in operating as well. But that's just projecting today's snapshot. Right. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes. Who has the next question? Yes.
Maybe sitting in the back row, I can't see all the numbers, but I just want to take a high-level takeaway from Mr. Shepherd's presentation. Is this the correct takeaway? That you believe, based on comparative analysis, that we are underfunded at our current assessment level, and maybe we were underfunded, for your recommendation, even at the assessment that was turned down a couple years ago?
I'm going to jump in on assessment because Charlie's charge and role is not to look at our assessment or different funding options. So I don't want to put him on the spot of making an opinion on assessment. I will say something that I'll check with Charlie to see if this is accurate. He doesn't believe we're devoting enough money to reserves.
Right.
Okay. Yes. Who has the next question?
Good place to be.
Sorry. Get over there. Who has a question for Charlie that he can't answer?
Carl?
Well, thanks everybody for coming. We really appreciate it. This is the end of our initial series, but not the end of doing these, and we want to make sure everybody stays engaged and participating as we go forward. So thanks again. Thank you.